Raindrops drenched the night, a cold rain that made the streets shimmer under the feeble glow of the streetlights. It was a night that made a crowd of drenched, disgruntled passers-by hurry up the sidewalk when they were drawn in by a homeless man sitting quietly against the wall of a building. His clothes were ripped, his face worn, but his countenance was composed, almost too composed. They looked at one another and agreed to have their fun at the expense of the man. They started with sneers and whispers, escalated into mocking laughter, and eventually hurled cruel words. The man didn't even bat an eyelid. He did not even flinch, much less return with something of the sort. He sat there, eyes straight, as if he had heard it all before. The silence was unnerving, as if he was watching them from a place far removed from their petty taunts. What if this man wasn't who he appeared to be? What if the quiet figure they were ridiculing held secrets far beyond their comprehension? One of the visitors, an astute young man who knew how to size people up, felt a creeping chill as he looked more closely at the vagrant. There was something about those eyes that seemed unsettling, deep and focused and sharp as someone who's seen much more than he would ever let on. These were not the eyes of a simple street battler. This was a quiet intensity, a hidden depth that suggested mystery in the past. The young man grew curious. Who was this man really? What kind of life has he led before finding himself here on this cold, rainy night at the mercy of strangers' scorn? Was there more to this than they had initially thought? And if so, just how much danger were they really in by provoking him? Cold rain continued falling in steady sheets, the beat of it pounding against the pavement like a rhythm to match the group's growing arrogance. They'd circled the homeless man, closing in on him with jeers and taunts. Their words began as light, almost playful, mocking his appearance and the condition of his clothes. But then the insults turned harsher, meaner. One of the men called him a coward for not defending himself, while another threatened to get the police involved. The rest laughed, egging each other on. But through it all, the homeless man didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. His body was frozen in place, as if he was part of the street itself, worn down and forgotten. His silence only seemed to provoke them more. They hurled a few more insults, expecting him to snap, to get angry or defensive. But nothing came. Why wasn't he reacting? What kind of person could remain so indifferent to such treatment? Could it be that he simply didn't care? Or was there something more to this man than they had assumed? The group's laughter began to die down as the realization began to sink in. This wasn't normal. Then, in the quietest of moments, the homeless man shifted. His head, which had been bowed, lifted slowly, and his eyes locked onto the group. It wasn't the empty, vacant stare they had expected. No, this stare was different, acutely sharp, calculated, and full of knowing. The words that came next were soft, but carried a weight, as if each syllable had been carefully chosen. "You shouldn't have come closer," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "One of you. You don't even belong here." The group froze. The man's eyes focused on one of them, a young woman with blonde hair who stood at the edge of the group. She was the first to speak, her voice quivering as she stuttered, "What do you mean? How do you know that?" But the homeless man didn't respond. Instead, he gave a small, almost sad smile and looked away, as if the conversation was already over. But his words had struck something deep in the young woman. How did he know her? She had never seen him before in her life. The unsettling calm of the man, the way he spoke without fear or anger, it made her heart race. What secrets did he know? And why did he seem so sure of things he couldn't possibly know? As the man spoke, the group stood frozen in disbelief, and his words seemed to echo in the air, stirring something deep within him. A flood of memories came rushing back, memories he had buried long ago. Suddenly the scene around them shifted, and for just a moment, the streets of the city faded into the background. The man's mind carried him back to another life, a life of danger, intrigue, and missions where secrecy was a must at every turn. He was no longer the homeless man. He was a highly trained CIA agent, a man with skills that made him nearly invisible to those who did not know what to look for. He had worked behind the scenes, gathering intelligence, orchestrating clandestine operations, and outsmarting even the sharpest of enemies. His days had been filled with high-speed chases, deadly confrontations, and the constant risk of betrayal. He was a master at playing the game, at hiding his true identity. But there had been a mission that went wrong. It was the reason he was no longer the agent he once was, the reason he found himself on these cold, lonely streets. The flashback flickered out as suddenly as it had come, and the man sat there in front of the complete strangers who were oblivious to whom he really was. He didn't know how to survive in the streets. He knew how to survive in a world full of secrets and lies. But the question remained in the air. Why did someone with such a powerful past want to disappear? What was it that had made him abandon his life as a CIA agent? What truth was he hiding? And could the strangers who mocked him ever understand? There was this thick tension in the air. One of the men, who was tall with a broad build, suddenly took a step back and looked nervously between the homeless man and the others. He was beginning to feel the gravity of the situation, knowing something wasn't right. Maybe we should just go, he muttered, looking around as if looking for an escape. The group had already gone too far. They had goaded him, and the mood now shifted. This fellow they'd laughed at and spat on turned out not a beggar or whatever, but something different. The dangerous way he'd look at them made them break out in chills, his presence threateningly present in the air. But the leader of the group, a young man with dark hair and a confident smirk, shook his head. "Come on, don't be scared. It's just a homeless guy." His voice was steady, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "We'll just finish up here and move on." He wanted to push forward, to show that they were in control. But they didn't. Know that they had just crossed a line. The homeless man wasn't some pitiful, feeble creature. They had been playing with fire. And now they would see what happened when you pushed somebody who had the skills to push back. The leader's bravado was no match for the quiet authority now emanating from the man. Something much bigger than the group could imagine lay in their future. What would happen when they continued to push? Would they walk away from this encounter? Or would they learn the hard way that some people are not what they seem? The group continued to linger, their confidence waning as the strange atmosphere around the homeless man deepened, never moving his gaze away from them, still as the coolness. The man spoke softly after what was a very long silence. "You should leave," he whispered gently. "Don't stay in my sight. Leave me." There was nothing in the softness of the tone. It was just this quiet assurance, no rage in him, no plea. But there was something in the way he said it, an unspoken threat that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. It wasn't the warning of a person with nothing to lose. It was the warning of someone who knew exactly what he was capable of. The group stood still, their bodies tense, the unease growing. Would they heed his warning? Or was it already too late? Had they crossed a line they couldn't uncross? As the man's words echoed in their ears, one of the strangers, a middle-aged man with a nervous tic, suddenly froze. A thought crossed his mind, a memory that had been buried deep. He remembered. A news story from a few years back, one about a CIA agent who had mysteriously disappeared. The agent had been known for his incredible skills in covert operations, and his disappearance had left many questions unanswered. Could this homeless man be the same person? Could he be the CIA agent that everyone thought was lost? The idea seemed absurd at first, but now, as the man's calm gaze pierced the group, the possibility seemed more and more real. What had the past brought to the present? Could someone with such power history end up in a place like this? The man said nothing, but his silence spoke 1,000 volumes. The truth of his past was also behind it, and seemed dangerously close. Fear swept through the group like wildfire. The once confident leader who had sneered at the homeless man with such ease now felt his body drenched in a sudden panic. He could feel sweat on his palms, his breathing picking up pace. He shot nervous glances at the others, their faces pale, their eyes wide open. The man was not just any homeless soul. They had crossed someone who saw and did things that none of them could even imagine. What had they done? Could they still walk away? Or had they already made a grave mistake? Was it too late to turn back? The thought of running crossed their minds. But the weight of the man's gaze made it clear that the situation wasn't going to resolve with a simple retreat. Would they make it out of this encounter unscathed? Or would they face the consequences of their actions? The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The homeless man stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. There was no rush, no urgency in his actions. Everything about him screamed calculated precision. In a few swift steps, he closed the distance between them, his presence commanding and undeniable. Without a word, he disarmed the situation with a simple yet flawless maneuver. One of the guys, who thought he was too bold to retreat a step, further was immediately disarmed. The homeless didn't need force to be exerted. That skill was good enough to leave any threat hopeless. It had all become too obvious now. The man was nothing like the normal homeless figure. The control in his hands with which he portrayed the situation left no doubt to it. His gifts were beyond question, his power unassailable. What manner of human being had the ability to wield such strength and has decided to be a vagrant? What was it that had straitjacketed him to this vocation? They stood as if petrified, unable to believe what they had just seen. The man still stood, tall, like something anchored, letting his gaze pass over each member one at a time. His face softened, and for the first time, a shadow of sadness crept into his eyes. He sighed and spoke in a voice that sounded almost broken. I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always a nobody. He paused to collect his thoughts. I left the CIA because I couldn't live with what I had done. I was part of a mission that went horribly wrong. It cost lives, innocent lives. I couldn't take it anymore, so I disappeared. I wanted peace. I wanted to be forgotten. The group listened in stunned silence. He had taken this life for him, not because he was weak, but because he wanted to pay for what such an act would result in. He sought sheltered realities on the streets, that no one would know who he used to be for once, a part of something so much darker. The truth of his past, its weight, was unbearable by them. It was not a survival story, but a man trying to escape the ghosts of his past. Could they, the ones who had mocked him so mercilessly, find redemption for their actions? The group was left speechless, their bravado shattered. The weight of the man's confession hung heavy in the air. They had come to this meeting with derision and scorn, never imagining that they would be faced with their own ignorance. The homeless man showed them something far deeper than they could have ever expected. The price of judgment, the cost of looking down on someone without understanding their story. And yet, despite everything, he forgave them. His forgiveness was quiet, almost as if it meant little to him. You didn't know, he said softly. But maybe next time you'll remember that not everything is as it seems. His words lingered in the air like a chilling reminder. Could they, in their moment of arrogance, have learned anything from this encounter? How would they carry the weight of their actions moving forward? The lesson was clear, but the true cost of it remained to be seen. As the man turned and began to walk away, the group remained standing in silence, the weight of his words still heavy on their minds. The rain continued to fall, washing over the street like a cleansing ritual. But it didn't wash away the questions that lingered. Who else might be hiding in plain sight? How many people had stories, tragic, powerful, and unimaginable that no one would ever know. The man disappeared into the night, leaving the group with more questions than answers. His past, his true identity, and the life he had chosen to leave behind would haunt them for a long time. And as they stood there, wondering who else in the world might be hiding their own truths, they realized just how little they really understood about the people around them. How many others might be carrying burdens that no one could ever imagine.